line.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it's a privilege to have the opportunity to speak on this legislation on a topic that is of great import to the constituents of the Line electorate. One of the issues, like many of us in regional Australia, one of the issues that is raised quite often, and in fact I think every day my office receives calls from constituents with issues and concerns about their access to telecommunications. And, Deputy Speaker, it's clear that the universal service obligation, created in the wake of the privatisation of Telstra some 30 years ago, is no longer a relevant consumer protection in this day and age. As a national carrier, Telstra was charged as responsible for delivering the USO, which obliged them to ensure every customer had and still has access to landline telephones and payphones, regardless of where they live or work. But in a world that has become increasingly mobile, it is obvious that consumer protections mandating delivery of payphones and fixed telephone service has for many become redundant, sadly so, in the regions. And as such, there is a need to update the USO to ensure that it safeguards broader voice services and broadband. The bill attempts to do this. The bill adds to the universal service obligation, which has traditionally only been binding for Telstra, by adding a universal outdoor mobile obligation, or UOMO, on Telstra, Optus and TPG by 1 December 2027, mandating reasonable access to telecommunications while outdoors, excluding in vehicles or vessels. This bill attempts to deliver a modern and more fit-for-purpose USO in light of available technologies and consumer preferences. But unfortunately, Deputy Speaker, it falls short of its intentions. Labor's bill proposes exemption powers that were not in the bill's consultation draft, arguably allowing the minister to limit how the USO terminology reasonably accessible to all people in Australia on an equitable basis applies under the UOMO, setting up what we might like to call a SOMO, sometimes outdoor mobile obligation. The bill excludes use from vehicles and vessels from UOMO, even though the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman expects using satellite while driving to become possible and ought to be included. Farming bodies have expressed concern that affordability is not in the universal outdoor mobile obligation. Expensive satellite technology might see telcos pass the cost on to consumers unless there are consumer protections. After significant recent debate on 000 connectivity failures, the NFF and New South Wales farmers query why emergency services connectivity is not required under the UOMO. The government says existing emergency call service determinations suffice. Consumer body ACCAN says until voice to satellite works, text to 000 should be mandated. Telstra say there is insufficient spectrum for UOMO, which might in turn force a choice between 5G and 4G, and thereby the closure of 4G, which could repeat the travesty of the botched 3D shutdown. A Nationals Consumer Protections Amendment would prevent adverse consequences. Mandatory domestic roaming should be part of the UMO, and indeed a future USO. If a call fails on one service, e.g. Optus, and another service is available, e.g. Telstra, the call could automatically connect to the other service. Telcos could resolve the commercial impact between themselves, just like banks did when customers could withdraw cash from ATMs of other banks. A fee was imposed, but in the mandatory domestic roaming context, that fee might be instead built into business models and ultimately pricing, subject to consumer protections. Deputy Speaker, the Nationals support a goal of extending voice and text coverage outdoors across more of the country because improved connectivity for regional Australians is a necessity. In cities and towns, a call dropout is an inconvenience. On a farm, in a forest or at a mine in a remote location, it's much more than that. However, the credibility of any government measure rests not on its aspiration but on its detail and reality. The telcos must also be able to understand precisely what is required of them, and consumers must be able to understand what they are entitled to expect. Nice phrases such as reasonably available and equitable access need to be measurable and enforceable standards. Clarity and a compliance framework is required to avoid risks that the obligation will be difficult to monitor and even harder to enforce. We do not need aspirational headlines. In other words, the system has actually got to work and be practical, reliable and affordable. This is why this bill must be deeply scrutinised, and there is little point in proceeding down a path of promising something better when there are numerous issues still to solve with the existing telecommunications network. Unfortunately, this bill will do little, if anything, to address the issues that my constituents have been increasingly facing. I'm receiving inquiries from constituents across the line electorate, from Failford, from Vasey, from Warhope, from Elands, who've been contacted by their landline telephone providers about changes to their service or have unreliable landline and mobile telephone services. Providers such as Dodo and Southern Phone have recently advised their customers that they will soon be ceasing their support of landline phones, and customers will need to transfer their number to a provider that does support PSTN technology, which is the public switch telephone network, the traditional copper wire telephone network, i.e. landlines. To complicate matters, these customers are also being told that 1. They will not be able to retain their telephone number, which in most cases they've had for decades. 2. That they can switch over to the mobile telephone or NBN network, which in rural areas in my electorate varies from less than reliable to non-existent. 3. That they can utilise a satellite-based service such as Starlink, which in many cases they cannot afford and hence do not want to have to do. Or 4. That they can wait for the low Earth orbit satellite to become a reality. But all they really need is to be able to continue to have a reliable, secure and affordable landline phone that the USO requires. And remember, in rural areas, the landline system provides far more reliability in times of a medical emergency, bushfire, flood and blackouts. And I recall a meeting at the Lansdowne Hall where there were issues with the local Telstra service, where the community actually asked Telstra to put in more payphones so that in the case of an emergency they could go to a payphone because they knew that they couldn't rely on their mobile service. Deputy Speaker, clearly the scenario is causing considerable anxiety, which has been compounded by the fact that customers have not been provided with a clear or satisfactory reason why their service cannot be converted back to Telstra and why they cannot keep their existing number. When these customers changed from Telstra over to another provider, it was a simple process and did not require a number change. Furthermore, in some cases where constituents have been proactive and contacted Telstra direct, they've received email replies that are vague, incoherent and challenging. I'm increasingly concerned that Telstra's planned exit from the copper network and preference to transition customers to the mobile wireless or NBN network is not consistent with Telstra's universal service obligation, for which it is funded $297 million per annum by the federal government. Then there is the issue of battery storage capacity at local rural telephone exchanges and mobile phone towers. Just recently, on Saturday the 28th of February, around midday, both the landlines and mobile service at Elands went out following a power outage. This was the third phone network outage in 1 month in the area. Only people with satellite internet could communicate and seek Telstra's assistance. How is it that the tower's battery storage capacity is insufficient to run the tower for a period after the electricity network power goes down? Surely that's the purpose for which the battery was installed. Even the existing universal service obligation is fraught with problems. And as other coastal electorates also experience at school holiday time, the large influx of visitors can and does overwhelm the mobile phone towers so they just cease to function. And a community of Harrington that I lived in knows that too well. Deputy Speaker, if we do move towards having an outdoor coverage obligation, it will only be meaningful if Australians' devices can actually connect to the services being promised. Yet many mobile phones are not designed for satellite connectivity. Regional Australians and older Australians and small businesses often retain devices for longer periods. A reform that functions only for the latest high-end smartphones is contrary to the principle of equitable access. The lessons of the 3G network rollback shows how important it is to have products that can actually use a new technology. Consumers and businesses were forced into unplanned handset upgrades and faced disruption to their lives and operations. And there can be no tolerance for problems or errors when it comes to emergency services connectivity. Australians expect that when they dial 000, their call for help will be received. The recent history of 000 outages and device compatibility has shaken public confidence in the system. Technical glitches will never stand scrutiny when it comes to safety and emergency assistance. Emergency 000 access must not be contingent on owning a new phone. I've already mentioned that telecommunications affordability is a critical issue, particularly for households and businesses in my electorate. If compliance with a new obligation significantly increases infrastructure costs, they will be reflected in retail prices. Regional consumers already face higher service costs and fewer competitive options than their metropolitan counterparts. A universal obligation must not translate into higher bills for those it is intended to support. It is very true that new and emerging technologies will always be coming at us, and we will have to adopt and adapt. Direct-to-device satellite technology will be an exciting development in telecommunications, with the potential to reduce long-standing coverage gaps across vast regions of Australia. Yet it remains a developing technology, with global rollouts still underway and significant technical and commercial aspects to be settled. Domestic carriers will depend on international satellite providers, whose pricing models and deployment schedules are outside Australia's direct control. The satellite rollout will occur in time, but legislating a universal outdoor mobile obligation will not magically deliver it and make it work and make it affordable. Deputy Speaker, the legislation leaves many issues in doubt and numerous questions unanswered. And the stark reality is that in many regional and rural areas like mine, the existing universal service obligation is falling short. I cannot see how government can rightly and honestly proceed to a new, bigger commitment without ensuring the current one is fixed first, and without ensuring the new technology to do it actually exists and is workable, reliable and affordable. With all these considerations, the government's bill might be better to be called a sometimes outdoor mobile obligation, and sometimes is not good enough when we're talking about critical infrastructure that underpins our personal lives, our businesses, our sources of information and our safety and security. Australia's geography makes connectivity both challenging and critical, and while new technologies provide an opportunity to ensure that our regions have access to telecommunication services, they must be matched by genuine reliability, not just promises. So, Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, I support further scrutiny of this bill by referral to a Senate committee. Such diligence is essential for essential infrastructure such as this bill proposes.